Thucydides has shown the causal connection between political revolutions and the fertility of the soil, but goes a step farther and points out the psychological influences on a people's character exercised by the various extremes of climate. In both cases, the first appearance of the most valuable form of historical criticism. To the development of dialectic as to God, intervals of time are of no account. From Plato and Aristotle, we pass direct to Polybius. The progress of thought from the philosopher of the Academy to the Arcadian historian may be best illustrated by a comparison of the method by which each of the three writers, whom I have selected as the highest expressions of the rationalism of his respective age, attained to his ideal state, for the latter conception may be in a measure regarded as representing the most spiritual principle which they could discern in history. Now, Plato created his on a priori principles. Aristotle formed his by an analysis of existing constitutions. Polybius found his realized for him in the actual world of fact. Aristotle criticized the deductive speculations of Plato by means of inductive negative instances, but Polybius will not take the cloud city of the Republic into account at all. He compares it to an athlete who has never run on Constitution Hill, to a statue so beautiful that it is entirely removed from the ordinary conditions of humanity, and consequently from the canons of criticism. The Roman state had attained in his eyes, by means of the mutual counteraction of three opposing forces, the monarchical, aristocratical, and democratic elements of the Roman constitution are referred to, the stable equilibrium in politics which was the ideal of all the theoretical writers of antiquity. And in connection with this point, it will be convenient to notice here how much truth there is contained in the accusations so often brought against the ancients, that they knew nothing of the idea of progress, for the meaning of many of their speculations will be hidden from us if we do not try and comprehend first what their aim was, and secondly, why it was so. Now, like all wide generalities, this statement is at least inaccurate. The prayer of Plato's ideal city, that at the sons of good men should always be better than their fathers, and the sons of useful citizens more useful than their fathers, might be written as a text over the door of the last temple to humanity, raised by the disciple of the Furrier in Saint-Simon. But it is certainly true that their ideal principle was order and permanence, not indefinite progress. For setting aside the artistic prejudices which would have led the Greeks to reject this idea of unlimited improvement, we may note that the modern conception of progress rests partly on the new enthusiasm and worship of humanity, partly on the splendid hopes of material improvements in civilization, which applied science has held out to us, two influences from which ancient Greek thought seems to have been strangely free. For the Greeks marred the perfect humanism of the great men whom they worshipped by imputing to them divinity and its supernatural powers, while their science was eminently speculative and often almost mystic in its character, aiming at culture and not utility, at higher spirituality and more intense reverence for law, rather than at the increased faculties of locomotion and the cheap production of common things about which our modern scientific school ceases not to boast. And lastly, and perhaps chiefly, we must remember that the plague spot of all Greek states, as one of their own writers has called it, was the terrible insecurity to life and property which resulted from the factions and revolutions which caused not to trouble Greece at all times, raising a spirit of fanaticism such as religion raised in the Middle Ages of Europe. These considerations, then, will enable us to understand first how it was that radical and unscrupulous reformers, as the Greek political theorists were, yet in their end once attained, no modern conservatives raised such outcry against the slightest innovation. Even acknowledged improvements in such things as the game of children or the modes of music were regarded by them with feelings of extreme apprehension as the herald of the drapeau rouge of reform. And secondly, it will show us how it was that Polybius found his ideal in the commonwealth of Rome, and Aristotle, like Mr. Bright, in the middle classes. Polybius, however, is not content merely with pointing out his ideal state, but enters at considerable length into the question of those general laws whose consideration forms the chief essential of the philosophy of history. He starts by accepting the general principle that all things are fated to decay, which I noticed in the case of Plato, and that as iron produces rust and as wood breeds the animals that destroy it, so every state has in it the seeds of its own corruption. He is not, however, content to rest there, but proceeds to deal with the more immediate causes of revolutions, which he says are twofold in nature, either external or internal. Now the former, depending as they do on the synchronous conjunction of other events outside the sphere of scientific estimation, are from their very character incalculable, but the latter, though assuming many forms, always result from the over-great preponderance of any single element, to the detriment of the others. The rational law lying at the base of all varieties of political changes, being that stability can result only from the statical equilibrium produced by the counteraction of opposing parts. Since the more simple a constitution is, the more it is insecure. Plato had pointed out before how the extreme liberty of democracy always resulted in despotism, but Polybius analyzes the law and shows the scientific principles on which it rests. This doctrine of the instability of pure constitutions forms an important era in the philosophy of history. Its special applicability to the politics of our own day has been illustrated in the rise of the great Napoleon, when the French state had lost those divisions of caste and prejudice, of landed aristocracy and moneyed interest, institutions in which the vulgar see only barriers to liberty, but which are indeed the only possible defenses against the coming of that periodic Sirius of politics, the despot of aristocratic origin. There is a principle which Tocqueville never wearies of explaining, and which has been subsumed by Mr. Herbert Spencer under that general law common to all organic bodies which we call the instability of the homogeneous. The various manifestations of this law, as shown in the normal regular revolutions and evolutions of the different forms of government, are expounded with great clearness by Polybius, who claimed for his theory in the Thucydidean spirit that it is a lasting possession and not a mere prize of the immediate present, and that a knowledge of it will enable the impartial observer to discover at any time what period of its constitutional evolution any particular state has already reached, and into what form it will be next differentiated. But possibly the exact time of the changes may be more or less uncertain. Now, in this necessarily incomplete account of the laws of political revolutions, as expounded by Polybius, enough perhaps has been said to show what is his true position and the rational development of the idea, which I have called the philosophy of history, because it is the unifying of history. Seen darkly as it is through the glass of religion in the pages of Herodotus, more metaphysical than scientific with Thucydides, Plato strove to seize it by the eagle flight of speculation, to reach it with the eager grasp of a soul impatient of those slower and surer inductive methods which Aristotle in his trenchant criticism of his great master showed were more brilliant than any vague theory, if the test of brilliancy is truth. What then is the position of Polybius? Does any new method remain for him? Polybius was one of those many men who are born too late to be original. To Thucydides belongs the honor of being the first in history of Greek thought to discern the supreme calm of law and order underlying the fitful storms of life, and Plato and Aristotle each represents a great new principle. To Polybius belongs the office, how noble an office he made it, his writings show, of making it more explicit the ideas which were implicit in his predecessors, of showing that they were of wider applicability, and perhaps of deeper meaning than they had seemed before, of examining with more minuteness the laws which they had discovered, and finally, of pointing out more clearly than anyone had done the range of science and the means it offered for analyzing the present and predicting what was to come. His office thus was to gather up what they had left, to give their principles new life by a wider application. Polybius ends this great diapason of Greek thought. When the philosophy of history appears next, as in Plutarch's tract on Why God's Anger is Delayed, the pendulum of thought had swung back to where it had begun. His theory was introduced to the Romans under the cultured stool of Cicero, and was welcomed by them as the philosophical panegyric of their state. The last notice of it in Latin literature is in the pages of Tacitus, who alludes to the stable polity formed out of these elements as a constitution easier to commend than to produce, and in no case lasting. Yet Polybius had seen the future with no uncertain eye, and had prophesied the rise of the empire from the unbalanced power of the ochlocracy 50 years and more before there was joy in the Julian household over the birth of that boy who, born to power as the champion of the people, died wearing the purple of a king. No attitude of historical criticism is more important than the means by which the ancients attained to the philosophy of history. The principle of heredity can be exemplified in literature as well as in organic life. Aristotle, Plato, and Polybius are the lineal ancestors of Fichte and Hegel, of Vico and Cousin, of Montesquieu and Tocqueville. As my aim is not to give an account of historians, but to point out those great thinkers whose methods have furthered the advances of the spirit of historical criticism, I shall pass over those annalists and chroniclers who intervened between Thucydides and Polybius. Yet perhaps it may serve to throw new light on the real nature of the spirit and its intimate connection with all other forms of advanced thought, if I give some estimate of the character and rise of those many influences prejudicial to the scientific study of history, which cause such a wide gap between these two historians. Foremost among these is the growing influence of rhetoric and the Isocratean school, which seems to have regarded history as an arena for the display of either pathos or paradoxes, not a scientific investigation into laws. The New Age is the age of style. That same spirit of exclusive attention to form, which made Euripides often, like Swinburne, prefer music to meaning and melody to morality, which gave to the later Greek statues that refined effeminacy, that overstrained gracefulness of attitude, was felt in the sphere of history. The rules laid down for historical composition are those relating to the aesthetic value of digressions, the legality of employing more than one metaphor in the same sentences, and the like. And historians are ranked not by their power of estimating evidence, but by the goodness of the Greek they write. I must note also the important influence on literature exercised by Alexander the Great, for while his travels encouraged the more accurate research of geography, the very splendor of his achievements seems to have brought history again into the sphere of romance. The appearance of all great men in the world is followed invariably by the rise of that mythopoeic spirit and that tendency to look for the marvelous, which is so fatal to true historical criticism. And Alexander, a Napoleon, a Francis of Assisi, and a Mahomet are thought to be outside the limiting conditions of rational law, just as comets were supposed to be not very long ago. While the founding of that city of Alexandria, in which Western and Eastern thought met with such strange results to both, diverted the critical tendencies of the Greek spirit into questions of grammar, philology, and the like. The narrow artificial atmosphere of that university town, as we may call it, was fatal to the development of that independent and speculative spirit of research, which strikes out new methods of inquiry, of which historical criticism is one. The Alexandrines combined a great love of learning with an ignorance of the true principles of research, an enthusiastic spirit for accumulating materials with a wonderful incapacity to use them. Not among the hot sands of Egypt, or the sophists of Athens, but from the very heart of Greece rises the man of genius on whose influence in the evolution of the philosophy of history I have a short time ago dwelt. Born in the serene and pure air of the clear uplands of Arcadia, Polybius may be said to reproduce in his work the character of the place which gave him birth. For of all the historians, I do not say of antiquity, but of all time, none is more rationalistic than he, none more free from any belief in the visions and omens, the monstrous legends, the groveling superstitions, and unmanly craving for supernatural, base superstitious fears, and that interest in the marvelous which is characteristic in women, which he is compelled to notice himself as the characteristics of some of the historians who preceded him. Fortunate in the land which bore him, he was no less blessed in the wondrous time of his birth, for representing in himself the spiritual supremacy of the Greek intellect and allied in bonds of chivalrous friendship to the world conqueror of his day, he seems led, as it were, by the hand of fate to comprehend, as has been said, more clearly than the Romans themselves, the historical position of Rome, and to discern with greater insight than all other men could those two great resultants of ancient civilization, the material empire of the city of the seven hills, and the intellectual sovereignty of Hellas.